cyber attack is a criminal behavior that is directed to damage, to disrupt, or even to destroy information systems and networks. Part of these information systems and networks are, for example, our PCs, our laptops, our smartphones, and more so, since we are living in extremely and even more interconnected world, for example, IoT devices. Part of the ecosystem that we have to consider when we think about the risk of cyber attacks are, for example, also critical infrastructures, and which are basically all the critical sectors, vital sectors that are running our economy and our societies. When we think about cybersecurity, on the other end, it's basically, we have to think about cybersecurity more as a sort of like a convergence of people, process, and technology. Therefore, cybersecurity are not just security measures, technical measures, but it's really about educating to have a sort of like cybersecurity mindset included in our life, both in our personal life, but also in our professional life at all stages. For example, institutions, private sector companies, clearly in our personal life, but also in academia, civil society organization, everything. Every subject, let's say every actors of our societies need to have a cybersecurity approach. Clearly there are some, let's say, basic concepts of cybersecurity, so confidentiality, integrity, and availability of data and systems. But the integral part of cybersecurity is to be able to put in place a set of like attitude, a set of approaches and behaviors, including technical measures to keep our system secure. When we think about cybersecurity, we have to consider different aspects. We have to understand what we have to secure, so basically the asset. We need to understand which are the possible vulnerabilities of the asset. What does it mean? It means that everything that we use and also that we create might have some vulnerabilities, meaning gaps and weaknesses. If you think, for example, about system and networks, there might be mistakes, for example, in the line of code that are building our system. This is often a vulnerability. It's like thinking about a door that might be open by criminals or by people that might have a sort of like illicit interest. So a vulnerability is a weakness on one hand. On the other hand, we have possible threats that are used to exploit this vulnerability. Threats, therefore, are either threat agents, so for example, different criminal actors that might be interested in exploiting the vulnerabilities, or with the threats, we also intend, for example, the techniques that are used for exploiting this vulnerability. On the other hand, we have a risk, which is basically the, let's say, the adding up of risk and of threats and vulnerabilities, which is the risk that we are running when we have to consider information system and networks. There might be risks that are natural. Think, for example, about natural disasters that might shut down, for example, servers. And this is an example of, let's say, unwanted risk. On the other hand, we have risk that might be more intentional and also more clearly technically related. Or, as we said before, since an integral part of cybersecurity is the human element, also related to the human nature. For example, exploiting social engineering techniques. When we think about the current world that we live in, that is extremely interconnected, we have to think that not everything that is currently connected to the internet, for example, critical infrastructures, were created when the internet exists. What it means that we have super advanced and highly technically designed devices, and on the other hand we have also structures and infrastructures that were created in an age where internet was not so widespread, but they are living now in the same ecosystem as we are, and we are using both of them. So this is one of the first problems that we have to consider. The underestimation I think we're getting better in terms of underestimation, especially from a member state point of view, and especially in the European Union, thanks to the extremely well-articulated work of the European Commission towards, for example, a strategic framework regarding cybersecurity and a cybersecurity agenda. I think all the member states are getting more knowledge and aware when it comes to cybersecurity. Still, there is a sort of underestimation, which is an inner aspect of cybercrime. Why? First of all, because we don't have an internationally agreed definition of cybercrime. We have a good understanding of the concept, and we set up a sort of like a common language for understanding each other when we talk state to state. But on the other end, still we don't have a sort of like worldwide accepted definition. Second problem is the underreporting aspect, because there are some forms of cybercrime that are considered either less dangerous, or on the other end, because there's not enough awareness, also from a citizen point of view, that you should report a cybercrime. This is extremely important to understand numbers, let's say, the numbers of cybercrime, and on the other hand, also for member state to set up priorities based on these numbers. This is one of the problems why there is still this sort of like misconception or not full understanding of the extent of cybercrime. There are some very good initiatives. The work of the European agency ENISA that is producing every year the threat landscape report is extremely important. Europol as well, with the EC3, the dedicated agency for cybercrime, is producing an extremely interesting report, the IOCTA, the Internet Organized Crime Threat Assessment, that is giving not precisely data, but it is at least trying to give trends and to give some sort of like priorities also for policymakers to understand how important it is to work on this, to fight on one hand and also to prevent cybercrime. When I think about, for example, underestimation of risk, in terms of like, for example, private companies, one of the increasing risk are, for example, insider threats. Insider threats are an extremely tricky point because it's very, very difficult to manage and also to sort of like act in a preventative way towards insider threats. On the other hand, one of the risks that is currently receiving some attention from the European Union, and especially dedicated to the private sector companies, but as well as institutions, and if I think about it also, for example, universities and academia, is the concept of intellectual property. Why? Because at the very beginning, cybercriminals started being interested in money. But once you spend the money is gone. Then the second step was understanding the extreme benefit that you can have stealing data. Because data, you can reuse them, you can create fake profiles, you can sell them, for example, in the dark markets, and so on and so forth. But then another step is intellectual property. So the know-how that we have in our, for example, companies, startups, that we have in our universities, this is extremely interesting. And that's how also why for us as individuals is extremely important to take care about our data on one hand, so clearly sensitive data, personal data, but also data regarding, for example, our family, our work, our social life, but also on the other hand, think also about, again, which is the asset that we want to protect. And that's how I think we're a little bit underestimating the risk that we are running in our societies, because we are not, let's say, managing properly data also from a personal point of view, not only from an organizational and I would say private sector point of view. 2017 has been considered let's say, the worst year in terms of cybercrime. I guess it happened also in the past and might happen in the future. One of the main points, especially I would say in the last couple of years, has been the rise in ransomware. attacks. And the critical aspect of ransomware attacks is that when at the first time, let's say, we were seeing attacks of ransomware attacking mostly, I would say, end users, or on the other hand, for example, private sector companies, specific businesses. I mean, clearly, banks and financial institutes were some of the most attacks, as well as also some institutions. So, for example, at a medium and a higher level. So, for example, at the city level, but also at the state level. The dangerous aspect is then that they started attacking what they're called cyber-physical systems. What are cyber-physical systems? More and more, as we said, since everything is interconnected, we are seeing the connection of, for example, critical systems in, for example, industrial settings. So, all those technical systems that are helping the automation, for example, in the industrial production, or on the other hand, also safety controls that are managed at the industrial level. Other examples of cyber-physical systems will be more and more, for example, IoT devices or robotics also, because they will have a sort of like big hardware that will have an impact in our physical world, but on the other hand, they will be, let's say, connected to the internet, and they will be given order, let's say, using connections. Therefore, they will be unsecure. And this is something that we have to deal with. And we had a sort of like wake-up call a couple of years ago with a big botnet called Mirai. And the interesting aspect of Mirai is that what ends up in the newspaper was that it attacked the Deutsche Telekom. When they started the investigation, they discovered that the first, let's say, weaknesses and vulnerabilities that they tried to exploit were, for example, toasters and baby monitors. Why? Because most of the IoT devices that we have in our societies, in our markets, they do not have the adequate level of security that is needed, thinking that they might be interconnected to the widest internet. And that's the problem that we're faced, because clearly criminals might exploit less secure devices to attack even bigger infrastructure. Another good example is the fact that this specific botnet, Mirai, also attacked an important DNS, so domain name system, called DYN, D-Y-N, and this brought down a lot of quite important or quite well-known web services, like, for example, the New York Times, Reuters. So the problem is that in that case, it was a sort of like side effect, meaning that this botnet propagated in such a fast way and in such an uncontrolled way because it was exploiting all the vulnerabilities and all the weaknesses. This is another step of cybersecurity. Not only we have to put on the market devices that are secure, but we have to patch all the vulnerabilities. This is another challenge that we have, because a lot of the devices and a lot of the infrastructures that we're currently using, and that they are, as mentioned before, critical and vital for our economies, might have all the vulnerabilities that still need to be patched. And therefore, that's why attacks against cyber-physical systems, attacks that are, let's say, stemming from the virtual world, but that are having more and more a practical effect, let's say, in the real world, are extremely worrying. A very good example is also last year's attack of WannaCry, where among others, one of the main targets was UK health service, and specifically a good example is the attack against an hospital. And for example, they had to reschedule all the visit. They have to pay attention to reschedule, for example, the time schedule of the ambulances. They had also to take care of some patients that are connected to some machines that were connected to the whole system. So that's why it's the first time that we're seeing some virtual attacks that have also quite a concrete impact on the physical world. GDPR is absolutely, I think, a game changer. It's absolutely a game changer for a couple of reasons. First of all, because it's including two aspects that for a long time have been considered in a sort of like separate way, privacy and security. Putting together privacy security really means raising up the level of knowledge and also of a sort of like awareness and understanding that we really need to boost the cybersecurity attitude that we need in our economies, because clearly GDPR has a very strong focus on private sector companies and also on institutions, but clearly more, let's say, the economic aspects. But on the other hand, it's also including not only measures regarding the data protection, even if the name is General Data Protection Regulation, but on the other hand, also some aspects of understanding which are the risks that you're running when you're running a company, when you're running a service, regarding the data that you're collecting, that you're managing, and that you're storing. This is extremely important. And I think it's a sort of like, clearly it's not the end point of the process from a legislative point of view, but it's absolutely a sort of like a milestone that we reach at the EU level, and also with, relationship with what they are called third countries, that will for sure raise the knowledge. And I also give some practical and personal example. Also people that are not directly affected by the regulation, but for example, they started receiving alert regarding the fact that due to the entering force of GDPR, they will be informed about how their data are collected and stored by certain services. I think it had an extremely good effect in raising the awareness also for the, let's say, normal citizen, the average user, in understanding how important are our data and the fact that we need to treat them with respect. I started working many years ago on a project called Hackers Profiling. It was around 2004, 2006, and we tried to apply, let's say, the technique of profiling to the world of hackers and try to understand the difference between hackers and cyber criminals, and on the other hand also to develop some sort of like profiles of the cyber criminals. And it's interesting because we try to have clearly a scientific approach, so with anonymous questionnaires involving institutions, private sector companies, law enforcement agencies, as well as exponents of the, let's say, of the independent security researchers community. And we developed some profiles where, for example, we had the script kiddies, we had the cracker, and we had some profiles that were kind of like guessed, meaning that we didn't have enough scientific knowledge, but from the interviews that we were carrying out, there were some profiles emerging, like, for example, the cyber spies, the cyber warrior, the fact that there might be more and more involvement from member states in the sort of like cyberspace, also when it comes to offensive technique. And this is the world that we're facing today, meaning that today we have one important aspect is that we have less and less, let's say, what is called the lone hacker, basically, but we have more and more involvement of organized criminal groups of two forms. One, more, I would say, purely virtual organized criminal groups, so groups that get together and they carry out one or a set of attacks, just maintaining, let's say, their activity in the virtual world. And then we have also groups that are called hybrid groups, where we have interconnections, for example, with more traditional forms of organized criminal groups and activities. Think, for example, about drug trafficking, about weapons trafficking, unfortunately human trafficking as well. And we have more and more links. I give a practical example. There is a famous case of the Port of Antwerp where a drug trafficker gang was unable, let's say, to hack the system, the monitoring system of the Port of Antwerp, and hired hackers in 2015 for carrying out basically their criminal plan, and they were able to tip off a set of containers full of drugs thanks to this. So on one hand, for sure, the attackers are more and more organized. They are thinking in terms of businesses. So they are really organized like businesses with hierarchical structures, with specific roles assigned to every different part of this business scheme. And therefore, we need also to think, when we have to think about fighting and preventing, in terms of like criminal organizations. We are facing, nowadays, we are facing more and more involvement of actors that are more difficult to identify. I'm thinking about non-state actors, or on the other hand, also state actors. And the problem that we see is that in the cyberspace, due to some specific characteristic of the internet and of the new technologies, it's very difficult, one important thing, which is attribution. So it's very difficult to attribute a certain attack to a certain, let's say, actor, or to the source of the attack. Therefore, we have a sort of like link among the different actors, and it's much more difficult to define a clear line. In my view, still, organized criminal activities are the most worrisome in this moment. We're seeing an increased interest from member states and also at the international level to understand how to better protect our societies. And clearly the first reaction, especially confronted to a sort of like high escalation in sophistication and also danger of the risk posed by cyber attacks, especially when thinking about critical infrastructure. And on the other hand, also the risk of emerging threat actors, thinking about, for example, terrorist groups. The reaction of member states is to increase the level of surveillance also that is needed, or the level of kind of like technological intrusions that is needed for carrying out investigations. Can be done safeguarding the privacy of the citizens? Absolutely yes. And I think the European Union is going in this direction and has very clear in mind the importance to find the right balance. And a practical example of a right balance is to involve in the discussions related also to national security issues, for example, civil society organizations and private sector companies that are producing the technologies, and the security experts. This is extremely important, as well as human rights experts, because we need, for really, I guess, for the first time in history, a sort of like a real multi-stakeholder approach, also when we deal with national security. And this is an important aspect. The second aspect is, for example, oversight of the agencies that are collecting data. Therefore, and this goes back to the importance of having solid regulations in place at nation-state level, but also having a sort of like umbrella framework when it comes to the European Union to have the concept of data protection and protection of fundamental rights as main guiding principles. Recently, in the first months of 2018, the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to privacy produced the annual report, and he was specifically mentioning the need for member states to carry out data gathering and to implement a surveillance technique always with respect of privacy and fundamental rights. 100% security doesn't exist, and we have to face it. Every system, every device is vulnerable. What we can do is to increase the level of security, and as mentioned before, is by working on processes, on people, and on technology. One of the biggest challenges that we're having nowadays is the world of the all interconnected devices, what is called the Internet of Things or Internet of Everything. And we are definitely going more so and so towards the direction of having really everything interconnected, even devices that we've never thought before. I always give the example of objects that we have in our houses. So for example, fridges, toasters, that have the ability now to be connected, for example, through an app with our phone. The problem that we have here is that we have to secure the fridge, the app, the phone, and the connection among the three. And therefore, we are kind of like opening the surface, what is called the surface of attack, because therefore, criminals might be interested in exploiting the different points, let's say, of the connection. And even more so, when we have to think about securing our societies, another important aspect is the supply chain aspect. We had in the last years this sort of like big trends of attacking, of worrisome attacks against, for example, critical infrastructure and industrial system. But also a worrying aspect is that the supply chain to arrive, let's say, to produce a certain good or a certain service is also made of a different step that might have a different level of security involved, and also made of different IoT devices that might have a different level of security integrated into the device. There's another problem, what is called the go-to-market problem, meaning that we are all running to have the best technological advancement of whichever device on the market quick and fast. The problem that we're facing is that to do that, unfortunately, security is always considered as a sort of like last point or as a sort of like additional point at the end of the process. We really have to think in terms of like security by design. We already started thinking in terms of privacy by design, but another step will be thinking in terms of like security by design, especially of these objects that will be more and more in our life, and that through the connection with these objects, clearly our data will reach the wider internet. Artificial intelligence and machine learning, which is the basis of artificial intelligence, are one of the best innovation, I would like to say it in a very passionate way, that we're facing, and and it's a trend that hopefully will last for a long time, is giving extreme benefit to our societies in terms of, as mentioned, of innovation, and also in terms of like quality of life that we can reach. Downside of technology is that all technologies and also artificial intelligence and machine learning, they can also be misused. They can open the door to new forms of criminalities. The problem that I see with artificial intelligence is that as well as we are using it for automating certain processes, so to have faster services, on the other hand, they can also be used by criminals exactly in the same way. So they can be used, for example, for automate the replication of viruses, of malwares. They can be used for a faster data gathering when it comes to organize and plan a cyber attack. They can be used specifically, for example, for spear phishing. Spear phishing is a particular type of phishing that is really, let's say, targeting, especially high-level target. So think about CEO of companies, or, for example, high-level representatives in the policymakers arena. And usually for carrying out this type of attack, you need to collect a lot of information because it needs to be extremely targeted. Thanks to AI, this part, the time needed for doing this, the labor needed for doing this will be extremely reduced. And for sure, we will also see new forms of threats because AI might be able also to combine the machine learning aspect might cause the fact that we will have viruses, malware of different nature that will be able to faster adapt to the protection that we're trying to put in place. And then we'll find in a sort of like a faster and easier way, sneaky ways to enter into our systems. The Geneva Declaration on Cyberspace and a sort of like having a Geneva Convention on cyberspace, all the debate around this concept highlighted a very important sensitive point in this moment in the international community. Why? Because for a long time, member states tried with different efforts and in different forms to give an answer to the risk and threats that we were seeing in cyberspace in different forms, even auspicating for a new cybercrime convention, or for having an international court in cyberspace, or having a treaty on cyberspace. All attempts that failed for different reasons, for the principles of application of the international law, or for example, of the principle of application of humanitarian law when it comes to cyber conflicts. We have also issues related, for example, to the relationship between private sector companies and member states when it comes to cyber attacks and cyber conflict, how you can regulate this aspect. On the other hand, how you can protect the civilians when it comes to cyber conflict. Therefore, I think that, and clearly all this also is kind of like confronted by the fact that we have very different approaches and perception in different areas of the world. That's why most of the efforts carried out up to now unfortunately weren't very successful. There was a specific group of experts, the UNGGE, called by the United Nations and specifically tasked to find some sort of like rules that might be applied in cyberspace, specifically when it comes to cyber conflicts and to cyber attacks. Unfortunately, the UNGGE failed to reach the consensus last year and therefore to report to the General Assembly. The problem is that having a consensus in this moment is extremely difficult. What the Geneva Convention is telling us is that we need to have all the actors at the same table and try to have a sort of like a real multi-stakeholder approach where we try to listen to all the different, let's say, users of the cyberspace that we are trying to regulate, because there are very specific aspects that need to be taken into consideration in a sort of like harmonized way. So this is a sort of like wake-up call for all the member states in really taking seriously the issue of sort of like creating common understanding and common set of rules that might be applicable. For the first time at the beginning of this year, the UN Secretary General specifically addressed the issue of cyber conflict, and he really invited member states to try to understand which are the best rules to protect civilians, so to protect populations when it comes to cyber attacks. So on one hand, we need to find rules, but on the other hand, we also think first and foremost about citizens. The current widespread use of technology and the current innovation in the field of technology are extremely encouraging. We are living really in a sort of like exciting times. On the other hand, we really need to think in terms of how this technology might also be misused. This shouldn't kind of like refrain innovation and progress. On the other hand, we need to develop technologies that are immediately, let's say, secure, and on the other hand, they can help in making all our societies more secure. What keeps me awake at night is the fact that more and more we are investing in extremely interesting technologies. Think about the blockchain, for example. Think about the use of big data analytics also in national security context. Think about all the issue of preventive policing, all the issue of managing the migration, border control, what they are called the smart borders, for example. Think about nano and biotechnology technologies and think about, for example, AI and machine learning, or the extreme progress that we're making with quantum computing. These are all technologies that are bringing extreme benefits, but on the other hand, we also need already to discuss about the basically not only the downside, but also the possible misuse and the possible effect that this technology might have when misused by criminals, but also the impact that might have on our fundamental rights. There is an important quote from Windsurf who said, that it's very difficult to legislate, to regulate the technology, and especially emerging technologies, because we don't know to which extent, let's say, they will be developed, how widely spread they will be, and also, I mean, which impact they will have. So the best thing to do is to start the discussion well in advance without being afraid of putting also security issues on the table, to develop a better technology since the very beginning.